A few weeks ago, version 3 of Tailwind was released, and together with it, also a complete redesign of the Tailwind website. What I particularly like is how code snippets are displayed via a sort of mock version of VS Code. Displaying formatted code on a page is not something new, but until now I never took the time to figure out how it was done. In this video, I will rebuild this mock VS Code and will share with you a couple of interesting features of Tailwind, such as the apply directive to style a third-party JavaScript library and the resolveConfig function to access Tailwind values via JavaScript. By following the Tailwind documentation, I already created a new Vite project and installed Tailwind. This is currently running on my local host. I can open up the page and start editing the HTML in VS Code. So I don't need this one for now. And I can start by creating a new div that will include all of the mock VS Code. I already know that inside here I will need other two divs, one for the top bar of the ID and the rest for the main part of the content. So I can start creating them. Now back to the parent div, I can style it by adding a few classes. I can set a max width to 7XL. I want it to be centered, so I can use the class mxauto. And I want it to have a dark gray background, so I can use bggray 800. The corner must be rounded, so I can use rounded XL or rounded LG. So with the first div, I want to create this top bar with these three circles. I want them to be aligned horizontally, so I want to use flex. What I can do is create another div, start using the class flex, and space them a little bit. I can use spacex 1.5. And now other three divs to create the actual circles. I can select all of them with Ctrl D and edit them in one go. So I want them to have width 2.5. Then since they have to be circle, I can assign the same height, so h 2.5. They have to be circle, so I'm gonna use rounded full. And I want them to be a lighter gray than the background, so they're gonna be bggray 600. Okay, something is showing up on the page now. Let's adjust the padding. So for the parent div, I want to have a little bit of horizontal padding and I can use px3. But also I want some vertical padding, so I can add a class to the parent div. So it's going to be py3. And since I want a border at the bottom of this div, I can then add border b for border bottom. And the color should be border gray 500. So now that the top bar is done, I can focus on what's at the bottom. There's a sidebar on the left and then the main content on the right. So since the content has to be horizontally aligned, I'm going to use the class flex. And inside here, I need other two divs so I can create the sidebar and the main container for the code. The content of the sidebar are going to be these icons. In the real version of VS Code, of course, these are buttons and they're probably created by different HTML tags, buttons, anchor, what have you. But in here, they're just SVGs. And what I can do is just look at the SVG directly in the code inspector, copy them and paste them as they are. As you can see, these 5 icons, they are all within the same SVG. I can just copy it all and paste it directly in VS Code. I can then do the same with the second one that includes the 2 bottom icons and paste it in as well. Okay, these icons still need some styling, but before I continue on styling them, I want to add in the code snippet as well, so it's going to be easier to see the actual dimension of the two divs. So for now, I can collapse these two SVGs and focus on this other div. In here, the container for the code snippet is going to be a pre-tag, and inside of it, a code tag. For now, I'm just going to add some text. So I want this div to have a fixed width of width 14. Then I want the first SVG to be aligned at the top and the second one to be aligned at the bottom. To achieve this result, I can use flex, but instead of aligning the content horizontally, I want them to be aligned in column, so I can use flex call. And I want some space in between each of them, so I can use justify between. And they have to be centered within the width of the sidebar, so I'm going to use item center. To make it more obvious where the sidebar ends, I'm going to add a border on the right. So it's going to be border R. And the color should be the same as the border for the top bar. So I used border gray 500. Okay, now it's clear what the width of the sidebar is. But somehow the text is still too much on the right. And this is not happening because the container for this text starts where the text starts. In fact, what I can do is add a class to the div that contains it and assign some BG color, like BG red 200. And it's clear that the content starts right after the sidebar. This happens because we're using the pre-tag. So what it's doing is preserving the formatting of the code inside of it. What we can do is remove all the spaces between the start of the pre-tag and the code tag. And now we can see that it's aligned correctly. All right, I can remove this class for now. So the color for the border that I used for the sidebar and the top bar is a little bit too light, so I want to be more subtle. What I can do is change this class and apply some opacity. I want it to be 30% of border gray 500. Okay, this is better. Now I want also some padding on the body tag. So I'm going to open up quickly the index.html file. And what I can do is add a class to the body tag. And I'm going to use p10 to add some padding. Back to the sidebar now. I have to style the icons a little bit. So I want the color of these icons to be different. And I can change them by changing the text color. And I'm going to use text gray 500. Also, I need a little bit of padding at the top and the bottom, so I can use py4 for that. All right, better. So we can see that the top 5 icons and the bottom 2 are a little bit too close to each other, but when I will add in the full snippet of HTML, this ID will grow in height and the icons will take their proper place as well. Before I start working on the code snippet, what I want to implement now is this bottom part of the ID, which would be the console. So I can add a new div just underneath the pre-tag. In here, I'm going to have an h3 tag with the title of the section, which would be problems. And just below, an unordered list with a couple of lines, which would be the 2 lines in the console. Each of them will start with an icon. What I can do is the same as I did before, so inspect the code, find the SVG, and just copy the HTML from the Tailwind side. I can select both li tag with Ctrl D and paste in the SVG. Each line in the console includes 2 different parts. Each one styled differently, so we have this first part styled one way and then this other one. What we can do is copy this text, so I can go just underneath the SVG and paste this in. Then pick the second part and do the same. and then again for the second line. Let's scroll at the end of the SVG. P tag, then a second one with the last part of the text. Okay, now I have all of the content and I just have to style it. Let's start from the container div itself. So I want a border at the top the same way I did for the sidebar and the top bar. So I can go to the parent div and add the class attribute. In here, I want to use border top, then it's going to be border gray 500 with 30% opacity. Since the text has to look like from a console, I'm going to use font mono, and the color should be text gray 200. I also want it to be slightly smaller, so I can use text XS. And I want some padding in this div, so I'm going to use P4. Alright, so it's just taking up a little bit of horizontal space. I can fix this by going to the parent div and assigning the class width full. Okay, now let's style the two messages in the console. First of all, I can define the text color by using the class textGray300 on the UL tag. Also, I want each of the LI tags to be a little bit spaced vertically, so I can use space Y1. And now it's time to style the LI tags themselves. I can select them both with Ctrl D. And the main thing I want here is that the icon and the two parts of the text should be aligned horizontally. So to do this, I'm going to use flex. And then I want a little bit of horizontal spacing, so I'm going to use space X2. Alright, starting to look good. The text and the icon still need a little bit of vertical centering, so I can use item center. And now it's time for styling the second part of each line, where the text should be a little bit darker. What I can do is select both instances with Ctrl D and add a class, and the color should be text gray 500. Okay, one last thing here, and what I want is that the problem's title should have a little bit of space. What I can do, I can go on the parent div and use the class space Y2. And now it's time to focus on the interesting part of this video. So how are we going to style the HTML code inside this mock VS Code? As I hinted at the beginning, we're going to use a third-party JavaScript library, which is called Prism Js. What this library does is break down all of the HTML code or any type of code in different tokens, and each of these tokens is assigned a specific HTML tag and CSS class, so each one of them can be styled differently. Now I'm going to work on the code and it's going to be clear later on. Alright, I can collapse a few things here since we don't need them now. And what I'm going to do is create a new Vue.js component where all the logic for Prism JS is going to be included in. I can add a new file here, and it's going to be called prismcode.vue. For now, I'm just going to add the usual hello world. Then go back to app.vue and start using it. So I can import it. I can add the components directive. And then add it here inside the template. Alright, so now it's visible here. The purpose of this component is to include these pre-encode tags. What I can do is cut them and paste them directly in the component. So I don't need this one. And I can paste this in. And now we're back to what we had at the beginning. What I want this component to show is the code snippet that is going to be passed in by the parent component. So I'm going to use the slot tag And what this allows me to do is to go back in the app.view and then add some text in here. And actually with something different so we can see. And now we can see that the content displayed by the Prism code component is exactly what is defined by the parent. So what I can do now is copy and paste all of the code snippet available on the Tailwind CSS site. So I can paste it in, and sure enough, we get an error. This is happening because Vue.js is trying to compile the code that you pasted, but since it's just a fragment of HTML, it's complaining that there's something wrong, it's not like there's an end tag missing, and all the errors you can see here. To avoid this error, what I can do is just undo what I did, and instead of passing in plain HTML, I can pass the value in as a string by doing this. And then inside the quotes, I'm gonna paste in again all the code. And this time, Vue.js is not complaining. Okay, now we have two issues. One is that the code is overflowing, and also the sidebar shrank a little bit. I can fix the sidebar by adding the class flex shrink 0, so it will always keep the width 14 size. Okay, and this is done. And then the next thing is fixing the code snippet, and what I can do is use the overflow hidden rule. Okay, now the overflowing code is hidden. Back to the Prism code component. I need to use Prism, so what I can do is use npm install Prism Js and install this package on my project. Now that it's available, I can close down the terminal and add the script tag, assign it a name, and now I can import Prism. Now that the library is included, all I have to do is add a specific class to the code tag. And this is to tell Prism which language it will have to format. And in this case, it's going to be language HTML. Okay, the result in the browser is pretty much the same as before, but if I inspect the code here, we can see that each of the token, each of the part of the HTML snippet is being broken down in different tags. So the class attribute is included in a span tag. Then we have this other span tag that includes the equal, and then the quote, and then the classes. So all of the HTML code has been tokenized and wrapped in a specific HTML that we can now style. To make it more clear what Prism is doing, what I can do is import the default Prism styling with this instruction. And now we can clearly see that all of the HTML code included in the code tag is formatted and styled. Let's remove this styling once again and focus on our own styling. The HTML created by Prism is something that I cannot change, so there are a few CSS classes defined by Prism. And what I want to do is apply some styling on those classes. Fortunately, Tailwind CSS has a mechanism to do that, and it's the apply directive. Let's go back in the browser and have a look at the code generated by Prism. So I have this tag, the div tag, which is wrapped inside a span with the class token and tag. If I want to change the color of this class, what I can do is define it inside the index.css file. So let's open it up. And I can use the layer directive from Tailwind CSS, and I want to apply this layer on the components. So now for a tag that has both token and tag class, I want to apply a different text color. So I'm going to use the directive apply, and I'm going to use text pink 400. If I open up the page again, I can see that nothing changed. I can inspect the code and go to the span that has assigned the token and tag classes, but no style is available for these two classes. And this is happening because Prism Js applies these classes after the page loads. These classes are not included in the HTML. This means that Tailwind cannot see these classes and doesn't create the relevant rules for these classes. To fix this, I can open up the Tailwind config file and I can tell Tailwind to inspect the Prism JS files and look for the classes that we'll have to generate. Prism is included in the node modules folder, so I can paste in the path to the JS file for Prism. Now, if I look at the page again, I can see that now the style is applied correctly. So I can now continue in styling this snippet. Let's have a look at the classes names. Now, the relevant class is @-value. So what I can do is copy these two classes and go back to my index.css. I can paste in the two classes I want and apply the style I want. In this case, it's going to be text sky 300. Alright, now what I want to style is also the equal sign and the greater than and less than that is used to create the HTML tags. So let's have a look at this class. This is punctuation and @equals. I can add these classes, punctuation, and then also it's going to be .token .@equals. And in this case, I'm going to use text slate 500. Okay, now what I want to change also is the class attribute. And in this case, it's going to be @name. And I'm going to use text slate 300. Now, the last thing I want to change is the text inside the tags. There's no specific tag for this, so I can apply a style directly on the code tag. So back to the Prism code component, and in here I can use text gray 50. All right, good stuff. The next thing I want to add is the line number on the left side of the editor. This is pretty easy thanks to a Prism JS plugin, so I can just import both the JavaScript and CSS for this. And then the next thing is adding a class to the pre-tag to tell Prism JS to use the line numbers. And here we go. Like the initial code formatting, the style is not quite right, so I can override this styling. First of all, I want to change the color of the line numbers. I can inspect the HTML created by Prism, and if I open up the pre-tag and then the code tag and scroll to the bottom of it, I can see that I have a line numbers rows. Then again, I can open it, I can see that there are several span tags and the line number is within a before pseudo element. Now what I can do is copy this class and apply the color I want. Here I can open up index.css and add one new rule for this class. And in this case, I want to apply the text gray 600 color. Okay, and now I want to remove this border on the right. I can see that the border right rule is applied to this class, so I can do the same. I can select this and create a new rule in my index.css file. In this case, I'm going to use the class border none. Alright, and now this looks good. There's a little bit of space here just below line 19, and I think I can just remove it from here by having the closing pre-tag right close to the code tag. Alright. One interesting thing that the Tailwind CSS website is doing with this mock editor is that it's adding this color indicator close to each of the text, background or border classes that refer to a color. This is something that is not easily achievable with Prism JS. This is because we cannot just add some arbitrary HTML and tell Prism not to tokenize it. So if I was to add a HTML snippet with the proper classes to create these color boxes, Prism will treat it exactly like any other HTML and will tokenize it and break down in different parts, so we won't see these results in the browser. What I have to do instead is let Prism do its thing, tokenize all the content, and then run some JavaScript to add in all the extra HTML I want to display on this page. More specifically, I can search the code snippet for specific classes like text teal 600 or text gray 500, and then whenever I find them, add in the HTML I want to use to create these color boxes. Let's see how it can be done. Prism provides hooks so we can run JavaScript code before or after the highlight of the code has been done. I want to run code after the highlight, so I can use the after highlight hook. I can use it on the mounted event, and I can define it like so. Prism.hooks.add. I want it to happen on the after highlight, and I can run a function that will receive the env variable. Through the env variable, I can access the highlighted code. And what I can do is perform just a search and replace. So I'm going to do env highlighted code dot replace. What I want to search is not a fixed string. It's something that can change. It can be a text, a background, or a border color. In order to achieve that, I created a regular expression specifically for the task and the code snippet that I'm dealing with. Of course, this is not going to work for all colors, all Tailwind classes, and so on, but will work nicely in this case. So now I can use the regex variable here, and then I can define the function I want to run whenever there's a match. Okay, whenever we find a match, it's something that looks like this. So it's going to be text gray 500. And what I want to do is create a background class starting from this string. So what I have to do is remove the first part of the class until the hyphen and replace it with bg. So what I can do is create a variable called Tailwind color config and set it to match.split. And I'm going to split it on the hyphen character. So with this, we're going to get an array of 3 elements that I can use to build my background classes. So I'm going to say Tailwind bg color is going to be equal to bg dash, and then I can select the element of index 1, and then I can concatenate also the element of index 2. And now that I have my variable ready, what I want to do is return some HTML to create the small color block, and then the string that I just found inside the highlighted code. So first of all, I'm gonna return my match. And before it, what I want to add is a span that I can style to look like the color block. I'm going to use the inline flex class. I'm going to use width 3, height 3. It's going to be rounded. I'm going to use ring 1. The color is going to be ring gray 900 with opacity of 30. And it's going to have a margin right of 1. And as a last thing, what I can do is add here the class I just created. So I'm going to use Tailwind bg color. And now that I have my new highlighted code enhanced with this HTML, what I can do is use the env.element variable and pass to its inner HTML the highlighted code I just created. Now let's have a look at the result in the browser. So something here is happening. For example, I can see that BG-Teal400 has this colored box. The same happens for BG-Gray300, and I can inspect the HTML, and sure enough, I can see the span I just created. But then there are other instances where this is not working as expected. For example, I can see text-teal600, and I can inspect the HTML here. I can see the span, I can see the correct background class, but the color is not applied. So what is going on? Basically, what we are doing is creating background classes dynamically via code. And since we create a background class starting from this other class, Tailwind cannot see it and cannot generate the proper class. So the BG-Teal600 class is something that doesn't exist in the CSS that Tailwind creates. On the other hand, Tailwind can see this string BG-Teal400, which is the same background class that we are using for this box. And this is why we can see the color here. Looking at the Tailwind documentation, we can see this dynamic class names section. What Tailwind is suggesting is that whenever you need a dynamic class, is define it this way. So the full name of the class is always visible and not building it in pieces like this. Something like this is something that Tailwind cannot understand. And this is exactly what I was doing just before. So let's go back to the code and fix it. So instead of building the class name I want, the other alternative I have is get the class name and find the corresponding color for that class and use just the hexadecimal code for that color. Luckily, Tailwind provides a way to interact with its configuration via JavaScript. And that can be done through the resolveConfig function. So I can import it. And then I can also import my config. And now that I have both resolveConfig and my configuration, what I can do here is create a constant and then call the resolveConfig method and pass in my configuration. Now, if I open up the browser and try to reload the page, the editor is gone. And if I look in the console, I can see this error. This is happening because somehow the Vite project doesn't play nice with the resolveConfig method I'm trying to use. Luckily, there's a workaround for this. What I can do is open up my Vite config file and apply the workaround I found at this address. I'm gonna leave it in the code, so if you want to reference it, you can just open it up and read it. Basically, what I need to do is add in post CSS here and then pass it into the configuration here. After this, I also have to change the post CSS config and use export default instead, so I can remove this and replace it with this version here. And then one last thing, I have to remove the module.export and use export default instead. Alright, and now we are back on track. Hopefully this will be fixed in a future version of Tailwind, but for now we can just use this. So I don't need this configuration anymore, I can close this down and this one as well. So now, for example, what I can do is do a console.log of my config, and more specifically, I can look at the theme and colors. So now when I load the page, I can see that I have an object in my console that lists out all of the colors I want. Then I can create a new variable and call it Tailwind hex color. And I'm gonna pick this color from the configuration. So it's gonna be full config.theme.colors, and I want to pick the one that has the color defined in my match here. So I have the name of the color like gray, yellow and red, and then I want to look for the number color, so that's going to be included in this second item. Now, just to see what I end up with, I can do again a console.log, and I can reload here. And now I can see all the hex colors I need. All right, let's close down the sidebar. I don't need this variable anymore, so I can remove it. I can also remove this console.log and this other one. Now the HTML I'm gonna create is gonna be slightly different, so it's not gonna be a class anymore. I'm gonna use a style attribute. And in this case, the background color is gonna be equal to this new variable I just created. Now back in the browser, I can close down the console, and finally now I can see the color boxes close to each one of the color classes. And this is all for the video. I hope you liked it.